Welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
I'm Jill, the host of The Nourished Child. Let me ask you something. Do you wonder if your child is getting all the nutrition they need? Or do you feel unsure about what's going on with your child and their eating? Feeding kids is hard. I've raised 4 of my own children, and as a pediatric dietitian who works with kids and families, I know the job of nourishing and nurturing our children is a big one, full of emotional swings, frustrations, and worries. That's why I created thenourishedchild.com, the ultimate parent resource for children's nutrition and feeding. There, you will find free articles, e-guides, and programs to help you better understand your child, food, your own feeding, and their eating. Check out The Nourished Child today. Head to thenourishedchild.com. And now for the show. Hi there. Welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast. I'm Jill Castle. If this is your first time here, I am truly honored. If you are a returning listener, welcome back. This is episode number 204, and today I'm talking about parent-feeding interactions and how they may change when you have a son or a daughter who is larger in size. Today, I'm briefly going to describe the different feeding styles, but I'm going to especially focus on the controlling feeding style and its associated feeding practice, which we call restriction. In particular, I want to explore a new study that came out that is linking the genetic tendency for becoming larger in size and how we feed our children. It's quite interesting. It's a newer study, but before we get into that, I want to give you sort of a breakdown on the different feeding styles. And the different feeding styles really kind of fall under this big umbrella called food parenting. And food parenting is really how you feed and interact around food with your children. It also includes education around food, includes monitoring what your children eat, role modeling. So it's this big umbrella. And one of the topics under the umbrella of food parenting is feeding styles. Now, feeding styles I've talked about on this podcast before. I've written quite a bit about it. Feeding styles are very interesting. There's ongoing research around feeding styles, and they align quite a bit with parenting styles. So a feeding style is generally categorized into 3 different types: controlling, so a controlling feeding style, an indulgent feeding style, or a diplomatic feeding style. And I'll run through these really briefly and quickly. You can head over to thenourishedchild.com if you want to dive in deeper with written articles on these topics, or go back to the archives in the podcast here. And I've done episodes about feeding styles before. But the controlling feeding style is really parent-centered. The parent makes the rules and is pretty absolute around following the rules, and also highly encouraging the child to eat certain foods and certain amounts of foods, hinging privileges like having dessert or watching TV around the types of foods that are eaten and quantities of food eaten. Punishments also used with this feeding style. For example, if you don't eat your green beans, you will not get dessert or you'll lose your TV privileges. So that's a very, very brief summary of the controlling feeding style. When we think about feeding practices that are associated with the controlling feeding style, there are several. There is pressure to eat, which we see a lot with picky eaters and children who are smaller in size. There is food restriction or restrictive feeding practices, which is what I'm going to focus on here in a little bit. And then the indulgent feeding style is characterized by being child-centric. So whatever the child wants is what the parent offers or gives or stocks in the kitchen. That, in terms of feeding practices, oftentimes you will see short order cooking or catering just to make the child happy and give them something to eat. So all these different feeding styles, including sort of the gold standard, which I mentioned is the diplomatic feeding style, where we have structure and boundaries and we consider our kids' preferences, but we don't necessarily always cater to their preferences, but we do give consideration to them. Diplomatic feeding style is really sort of where we want to be headed with our parenting around food. But for today's purpose and for this episode, I wanted to talk about this whole idea of, does how we parent our children around food contribute to how they eat? And as an extension of that, does it change their body size? There's been a lot of research. I'm going to scroll way back to one of my favorite pieces of research by Allison Ventura and Leanne Birch back in 2008. And I'll include the link in the podcast notes for this study, but it's entitled, Does Parenting Affect Children's Eating and Weight Status? They title that so eloquently, but I want to just bullet some of their findings, and I'm setting us up for the next study I want to dive in a little bit more on, but I feel like in order to understand that study, you need to understand a little bit more about how controlling feeding style and restrictive feeding practices can change the way our kids eat and can potentially change their body size. So they found that when food restriction or restrictive feeding practices were happening, and that's sort of like if you're a restrictive feeder, you might disallow any sweets and treats in the house. You might control your child's portions. You might hide indulgent foods like candy from them so they don't access them. You might put cookies way up high in the cabinet so the child could never reach them. That's sort of, there's a lot of different characteristics, but that you kind of get the idea from just the general sense is to control any food that is deemed unhealthy and keep it away from the child. So what Leanne Birch and Allison Ventura found in their research article was that when kids were restricted, they actually ate more of those restricted foods. And this was associated with a higher body size and potentially more weight gain. Additionally, they found that parents who use these practices can cause a child to consume more of these types of foods that they're restricting, but also develop a stronger preference for these foods. They found that the more restrictive a parent was around food and feeding their child, the more likely a child would have a higher body weight or a larger body size. Restriction also was associated with higher levels of eating in the absence of hunger. So eating in the absence of hunger is a research term used to describe children who eat for other reasons other than hunger. So, for example, a child might eat because they're bored. A child might eat because they're sad. A child might eat because they are celebratory and they're happy, but they're not necessarily hungry. So that's what eating in the absence of hunger describes. And what they found in their research was that if you restricted sweets and treats, there was a link between that and higher levels of eating for other reasons. Lastly, they found that when parents were restrictive with their feeding, the child was more disinhibited or would be more likely to lose control around the foods that were being restricted when there was free access to them. So it's all very interesting. This is not new news. This information's been around for a long time. But they also suggested at the end of their research that larger children with larger bodies, elicit a controlling feeding style and restrictive feeding practices. So what does that mean? It means that if you're raising a child in a larger body, you are more susceptible to being restrictive around indulgent foods and being more controlling with food in general and with feeding your child. Again, this may or may not apply to you, but this is what the research is sort of shedding light on. So many of you know that I have written a book that will be coming out next August called Kids Thrive at Every Size. And in the research for this book, I looked into the genetic tendency to develop a larger body. And I found in the research that there is a 40 to 70% heritability for quote unquote obesity, depending on which study you look at. Most children with excess body fat have what is called polygenic obesity, meaning there are multiple genes, each having a small but accumulating effect that elicits higher amounts of body fat and which contribute to developing a larger body. Of course, there are other influences too, such as the general environment a child grows up in, but the genetic tendency to develop a larger body is real, and for some kids, it's a significant factor. So this next study we're going to talk about looked at parents' behavior with feeding when their child had a greater or higher risk for being larger based on their genetics. This study came out in the International Journal of Obesity in 2022, and it was called Parental Feeding and Childhood Genetic Risk for Obesity, Exploring Hypothetical Interventions with Causal Inference Methods. I'll include that link too if you like to go down the avenue of reading the research. I'll put it in the show notes as well. But the researchers of this study too found that parents were more likely to restrict their children's food intake if their child had a greater risk genetically to develop a higher body weight or a larger body. They hypothesized that the feeding practices that parents used during childhood are intermediate factors on the pathway between genetic risk and child BMI. They looked at 3 different types of feeding behaviors. One, they looked at emotional feeding, which they gave an example of, quote, I cheer her up with something to eat if she is sad or upset. They also looked at restriction, and the example they gave there was, I deliberately keep some foods out of her reach. And they looked at pressure to eat. And the example they gave there was, I insist she eats all the food on the plate. So these 3 parent feeding behaviors were considered to be mediators. They either helped or they hindered the genetic expression of growing in a larger body by the age of 12 years. So if a child had a greater genetic likelihood to be larger in size, they found that this would be associated with greater parental restriction. Again, this would be marked by the tendency of the parents to control their child's food intake by keeping food out of the child's reach, for example. These researchers in the study, hypothesized that if we could shift the parent feeding practices to what they would have been if the child was at low risk for a higher BMI, it would reduce the tendency or likelihood for a child to gain excess body fat. Their results, in fact, indicated that shifting parent feeding behaviors to what they would have been if a child had a very low genetic tendency for becoming larger in size resulted in a smaller likelihood of developing a higher BMI or a larger body. This suggests that some of the health disparity associated with genetic risk might be mitigated by intervening with parent feeding practices. They say, changing parent feeding practices has the ability to mitigate some of the genetic tendency associated with developing a larger body in childhood. In other words, changing your feeding strategy, especially if you tend to be controlling or using restrictive practices, may actually be an intervention strategy if your child is growing up with a larger body, which is amazing, right? Because the genetic tendency or the genetic liability, which is what they call it, is quite strong. 40 to 50% is a pretty strong underlying genetic predisposition. And being able to mitigate that or change the outcome of that just by using productive feeding practices and getting away from things like being too restrictive could be quite encouraging. They say that minimizing counterproductive food parenting behaviors may change a child's eating behavior, especially those behaviors that are associated with weight, such as reducing responsiveness to outside or external food cues, increasing sensitivity to fullness cues, and more fruit and vegetable consumption. So what does this basically mean? It basically means that if we can minimize food restriction or restrictive or controlling feeding styles, we might be able to improve children's eating behaviors. And for those children who are responsive to outside food cues, like the sight of food or the smell or the memory of the taste of food, we can perhaps even minimize that responsiveness. We could improve their sense of fullness and improve their consumption of fruits and vegetables, which balances out the diet sometimes a little bit better. So in conclusion, they found that parent feeding interventions, so getting help for improving your feeding style and improving your practices, especially if they are restrictive, that kind of help has the potential to buffer some of the genetic tendency for growing up in a larger body. Even in the face of the highest genetic tendency, parent feeding strategies and intervening might still make a difference. So I thought that was a fascinating study because we don't talk about the genetic tendency for being in a larger body, but it's a very real thing. And it is interesting to me that helping parents improve their feeding approaches with their children who happen to be growing up in a larger body can help quite a bit. It sounds like can help improve or lessen even those eating behaviors that are promotive of excess body fat. So I will include those studies in the show notes, but that is it for now. Don't forget, I do have more information about child nutrition on thenourishchild.com. I also have room for a few more families in my private practice, and there's quite a library of podcast episodes in the archives of this podcast. Just follow me on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the podcast and scroll back. There's a lot there, over 200 episodes. Meanwhile, give that child, small, large, or in between, a loving squeeze today. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child Podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.